first thing we're talking about today is Russia, and we have more news here and building on the tensions between the U.S. and I guess mainly our European but British allies and Ukraine over how big of a threat that Russia actually poses to Ukraine. We had the Americans, including Biden, the White House press secretary Jen Psaki, the Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby, all putting out that, a Russian invasion is going to happen. We've heard Biden use this rhetoric that when the ground freezes, Russia's going to go. They've talked about military buildup of troops of between 100 and 125,000 on Ukraine's border. Failed to mention that almost every single one of these troops is also within Russia and also on Ukraine's border. Almost every time actually doesn't mean on the Ukrainian border, Connor, but actually means, dozens, if not hundreds of miles into Russia, and maybe even closer to another country like Belarus than Russia. So far more complicated than, Russia just has a bunch of troops on the Ukrainian border ready to roll across and to take over the country. But you have the Americans, the British, warning that, again, this invasion is going to happen. And then you have now the Ukrainians saying that, no, don't start a crisis. Russia hasn't decided if they're going to invade or not. Now, I did read today, Connor, that the Ukrainians are saying that they would know 3 to 7 days before a Russian invasion if Russia was taking the steps to invade. So I do wonder if there's a little bit of just looking at time difference here where the Ukrainians are saying that, a Russian invasion isn't imminent, and they're saying that we'll know if it's happening between 3 and 7 days from now. And the U.S. is saying that it's going to happen in about a month. But anyways, the way it's being phrased by the two sides is very different. And of course, the Ukrainians are interested in, people doing business there, people coming and traveling. And if Russia's going to invade, nobody's going to open a factory. Nobody's going to come travel. In fact, people are leaving and doing everything they can to get out of the country. Again, if they really think Russia's going to invade. Ukraine feels like the U.S. really amplified this narrative, telling Americans to get out of the country and also telling the families and their embassy staff to leave, and also, allowing diplomats to leave if they want to. We also have in the past couple of days the U.S. announcing that diplomats, the diplomats' families in Belarus should start leaving the country there as well. I guess, this being a Russian ally country, and likely if there was going to be a military operation in Ukraine by Russia, I do think Belarus would be involved. So that's kind of sensible. But at the same time, this is hyping the threat of the Russian invasion. And so this is, distinctly something that the Ukrainians are now against. And so you have the crazy situation now, Connor, where the country that the U.S. says is going to be invaded seems to have absolutely no real fear that they're going to be invaded, or at least, again, not in the short term. They don't think it's actually going to happen. But at the same time, that country wants weapons. And so we have this interesting balance that Ukraine is trying to walk, where they're telling the European countries, send us weapons. And they're mad at the Germans for not sending them weapons. But then they're also upset at the U.S. for sending them weapons. And along with, sending Ukraine weapons comes the war rhetoric. And I don't know, maybe somebody just didn't inform Zelensky on how the U.S. empire works, where if you're going to get weapons, there has to be like a threat of war, so the Americans are willing to throw away hundreds of millions of their tax dollars for no reason. But so they're trying to walk this very interesting line where they want the weapons, they want some inflated rhetoric on the war issue, but generally, right now, I think they think it's gone too far and are trying to tone it down. So in this way, I don't know, Connor, things are maybe going a little bit well, right? Like Ukraine's tamping down the rhetoric. Russia is saying that they're interested in talks. But at the same time, there's a lot of different tensions and incentives here. One interesting detail that I picked up today, and this is from somebody who works with Voice of America, I believe. So this is, a journalist who oftentimes would be speaking like the U.S. official propaganda narrative. And he's saying that the U.S. has not shared the intel about the imminent Russian invasion threat with Ukraine. The sources close to the Ukrainian government told me American officials are only citing the intel report, but not sharing the document itself with Kyiv, they clarified. And so again, this is like an official U.S. government leak. I don't think he would have said it if the Americans didn't want it out there. And that they're not giving Ukraine this intelligence seems very odd, right? Like, if you really thought that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, wouldn't you want the Ukrainians to have all the information they could about that invasion? Now, my guess is that they'll end up citing like sources and methods or something like that. And maybe in a little bit of fairness, they view the Ukrainian government as likely infiltrated and having leaks and all kinds of corruption issues. And which to me would suggest that you wouldn't want to send that government hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons if you can't even give them a piece of intelligence. But that's what the U.S. government is doing right now.
They even suggested that in the Yahoo piece about the CIA paramilitary program there. They're like, we think it's been infiltrated and that some of these people have been targeted. I think they said for assassination and stuff like that. So do you think the upshot of this leak is to suggest that Ukraine might not be, are they trying to suggest that they're not as aware of what's going on as we are, so that they, when they say that the threat is not imminent and they try to throw cold water on all of our hyperbole, that it's not, it's just, they don't know what we know kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, of course, going to be very important for the U.S. mainstream media, who may this week really start to face questions from the American people. Why you have the president of Ukraine, not, the foreign minister or some other government spokesperson or, Washington Post article with unnamed Ukrainian government officials. Even if those are official leaks, it is different to the American people if it's some government official versus the Ukrainian president out there saying that America is causing a crisis and all that. They're going to have real questions as to why the hell we're supporting a war that, we're more afraid of than the Ukrainians. And so I think a good question. Now, moving on to the bad news category here, Connor. The Ukrainian, I think National Security Advisor, was saying that his government shouldn't be forced to fulfill all the Minsk agreement. Very importantly, Connor, the Minsk agreement is what brings a resolution or a ceasefire to the war is on a slow boil. People die by the hundreds, if not thousands, annually now because of the war in Ukraine. I think I saw that they finally upped it, the number they say, from 13,000 to 14,000 people have died in this war. And so, there are people dying there. But at the same time, that, territory is not being exchanged. I think for most people in these two territories, life goes on. Not to say that people aren't terrorized by sniper fire and shelling along the line of control and everything, but it's not like maybe a Syrian war situation or something even to that extent. And so the Minsk agreement is important, but the Ukrainians are saying that, they don't want to implement it all, which I think is going to be a real issue for Russia, and maybe suggest that Ukraine does have ambitions to retake this territory and not give it the autonomy that the Minsk agreements call for. So all this is very important. Want to move on here, Connor, and talk about something that happened yesterday, where the U.S. initially reported that Russia had delivered a letter in response to the U.S. letter addressing the Russian security proposal. So a little bit confusing there, but this is the back and forth diplomacy where Russia put out several points in a security proposal. Primary objectives would be having like an official agreement not to expand NATO further towards Russia, or I guess, secondary agreements, things like military exercise and missile placements and all that. And so the U.S., after I think a couple neggings from the Russians, delivered a letter in response that has not been made public. That was a condition of the U.S. to not make that letter public. And then yesterday it was reported from the Washington Post that the U.S. had responded, or that Russia, had responded to that letter. Now, the Russians clarified, and I think Lavrov further clarified after his call today with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, but Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov clarified that that letter was actually not like an official Russian response or a counter proposal or something like that, but rather seeking clarifying answers from the United States on their security commitments. And so I think Russia offered or had similar questions for the Europeans, and it seems that they are trying to really maybe nail down where an agreement could be made. So it does seem to me that, this does suggest that Russia is still very much on and interested in the diplomatic path. My guess is, though, and this is one of the reasons why I want to talk about all of this, is that the Hawks in the U.S. are going to spin it as Russia dragging their feet to either wait for the ground to freeze or to prepare an invasion. Putin gave a speech today, Connor, and a lot of, Russian press conferences and speeches aren't usually short, and I haven't had time to go through the whole thing. But I think the most significant thing that Putin had said, or at least, being amplified in Western press so far, is that NATO and the U.S. are ignoring the key Russian security demands, and that, of course, is an official closing of the door of NATO expansion, at least NATO expansion towards Russia's border. So, and when they say that, I'm guessing they're including 5 countries: Albania, Ukraine, Georgia, Finland, and Sweden would be my guess are the countries that Russia is most concerned about, although, probably in the order that I gave them in there too, looking to prevent NATO expansion. Although not Albania, I think probably Moldova is the second country I meant. Connor, I think you're probably looking that up, about ready to correct me. So, yeah, that's important from Putin's speech. I want to mention that there was a UN Security Council meeting, and if I had bet money, Connor, that this was going to turn into a shouting match between an American diplomat that really doesn't understand and a Russian diplomat that does, I would have been absolutely right. That's what happened. So, nothing productive, came out of this meeting, but the fact that the UN Security Council continues to assemble just basically for the U.S. and Russia to shout at each other seems kind of counterproductive. I believe the meeting came at the demand of the Americans, not at the request or demand of the Russians. Positive news, Putin has spoken with Macron 2 times in 4 days. And, one of the things, Connor, that we've talked about on this show, and something important that we've highlighted, is Ukrainian membership into NATO would require unanimous consent of the NATO members. And that includes France and Germany, that I don't think are very interested in allowing Ukraine into the alliance and guaranteeing that, these 2 states would go to war in defense of Ukraine. So, one of the things that I brought up, by the way, me and Connor were recently on the Crashing the War Party podcast. That's the great Kelly Vallejos and Daniel Larison's show. And one of the things that I had brought up on there, Connor, is that, in a way, saying that Ukraine isn't going to join NATO and making a deal there isn't even a concession, because nobody's going to let Ukraine join NATO anyways. But the Americans don't want to, even make that kind of statement. So, maybe one of the things that could be done here is if, it would be a very bold move on the part of the French or the Germans, but, maybe France is still feeling a bit miffed about the AUKUS agreement or something like that, and would be willing to make some kind of deal, maybe even if it's not a public agreement with Putin, to really take NATO membership off the table for Ukraine. And I believe, from my understanding, France would have the power to do that. Now, Putin might think that a guarantee from the French doesn't mean a whole lot without the Americans, and that could be absolutely true. I have heard reporting that Putin has given up on the Europeans, but at the same time, these 2 calls in 4 days suggest that Putin is heavily pursuing diplomacy in all aspects, not just with the Americans. Before we wrap up the conversation on the Russia situation here, Connor, I want to mention that the U.S. is carrying out a series of war games in Michigan. They're carrying out the Winter Strike war games with Latvia, bringing over dozens, if not hundreds, of Latvian soldiers to train in the snowy conditions of Michigan. And then we have the Allied Spirit aerial war games that are set to take place in Germany. 15 countries are taking part in this, 5,200 total troops, massive war games that we're talking about here. And then the Florida National Guard is taking part in the training of Ukrainian forces, including showing Ukrainians how to use buster bunking rockets. And so lots of different technology being, shown here and introduced to the Ukrainian military. And of course, this is something that I think Russia does find problematic, the training and advancing of the Ukrainian army, particularly, if it did get to the point where the Ukrainian government, rightly or wrongly, assessed that it could try to retake the Donbass region or something like that and restart the civil war that would, of course, involve Russia. So, I don't know, Connor, what are your thoughts are what's going on here?
Well, I mean, it's interesting how they continue to. I sort of lean in the direction that I think Gilbert Doctorow and Ray McGovern are correct, that they have this sort of. They've triaged their demands, so you have the primary concerns up front, like NATO membership on Ukraine, closing the door to NATO, to Ukraine's membership in NATO, but that they're also, I mean, the secondary concerns are also, really, maybe not ostensibly, but are the real primary concerns, given that they probably already are realized, like what we just said, that Ukraine's not joining NATO. And we've gotten messages from the administration already that it either won't happen in a decade or certainly not in the near term. And they have too much corruption going on. And even the fact that they're unstable borders, there's all kinds of reasons just to deal with the UN charter why they can't be brought into NATO. And of course, they're not going to get the unanimous assent anyway. But I think that, like you said, I think we covered it all last year. You covered on the last show that the numbers of the days that we had U.S. warships in the Black Sea were up about 100 days up from the 2020 numbers. So we had warships in the Black Sea, on Russia's doorstep 182 days last year, and we knew that was going to happen because I believe within a week. No more probably than 2 weeks, but I'm pretty sure it was in the first week. I wrote something about this back then in February that, Biden, one of the first things he did was he sent warships into the Black Sea. And they had already said, as Dave DeCamp was reporting at the time, that NATO and the Russia Hawks were saying that, because of COVID, we weren't able to spend so much time in there. And we were upset that our numbers were lower than they were in 2019. So we're going to really step it up. Well, then they ran Defender Europe 21 and all these crazy exercises throughout the whole year in Eastern Europe, including having, American and German tanks racing each other just off of Russia's borders I think it was in Latvia. These provocations are what precipitated the crisis. And the Russians were already reacting to it the first time they started their, build up, in the colloquial sense, near Ukraine's borders in April, and then again in the summer, and then again at the end of the year here. So I think that they essentially, NATO jumped the shark and just pushed the envelope too much. And I think the Russians basically see that the Americans they're overstretched, and right now Blinken and Joe Biden are not the most intimidating figures in the world, and they're probably easier to deal with than somebody like Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, who are just, probably would have already been, New START would be gone by now if Donald Trump was still president. So we'd have it would be even more chaotic of a situation. But I think that their main concerns are probably, ending the drills that were constantly taking place, not just in the Black Sea, but in Ukraine itself, and the restoring the INF treaty and talking about missile placements. They definitely do not want those offensive strike weapons in Ukraine. And I think they also would like to see the ABM sites taken out of Poland and Romania. I also saw that the Russian arms control director of the foreign ministry was saying that they want to get they said there's 200 American I forget exactly what the name of it is. B something. I'll find it later. But it's essentially there's 200 nuclear weapons as part of NATO's joint nuclear mission in 5 non-nuclear NATO states, and they want those completely out. They want those taken back to U.S. territory, and on U.S. soil. So I think that I don't know if that's if that's just a way to get the INF treaty restored, or if that's a way to get better to get the ABM sites out. So if they can set a demand that then they can say, all right, well, how if the Americans refuse that, then they can say, okay, well, then how about this? And so perhaps that's what we're seeing, in the same way that they say we want the door closed to NATO membership. Blinken and these types are not going to say that, because it's like a matter of NATO's pride and all this. But we are seeing positive statements from even people like Stoltenberg saying that they'd like to continue talks. And they clearly realize, as was said recently, that they realize how dependent Europe is on Russian natural gas, and that there's a reason why the NATO, a lot of countries, especially Russia, won't get behind. Especially Germany will not get behind all these crippling sanctions they have planned for Russia. And it doesn't appear that invasion is going to take place anyway. I think this is, Gilbert Doctorow talked about how they have essentially a complicity between the Americans and the Russians, that in order to have these discussions about revising the security architecture of Europe and Eastern Europe, in particular, that there has to be some sort of precipitating crisis to justify those talks, because otherwise, I think American political considerations wouldn't allow it. For one thing, and Ray McGovern has said that essentially this is a way, that they're using it as a way to get the talks going, essentially as a way to it's more of not really like, I suppose it is kind of like extortion in a way, but it's a defensive maneuver in order to carry on the talks and get somewhere. And so I think we're probably headed in a good direction, but I think Zelensky, as you said, realizes that I think the Americans want Ukraine to play a huge part of like the damsel in distress right now, to go along with that, if that is what's going on. And Zelensky realizes that it's going to really just continue to destroy his economy. Their currency has dropped to levels that were as bad as, a year into the war, after the coup, at this point. So, and I don't know how much longer they can keep that up, if that's, because like, I think I just heard Dave DeCamp on Scott Horton's show saying that the bases in Western Russia where they're, sending the troops, excuse me, they're at least 100 miles outside of the off of the border. And like you said, some of them are closer to Belarus anyway. So, and I think Republicans, of course, they want the transcript release of the call with Zelensky. So there's also a partisan element in this, as the narrative is going to fall apart rapidly. So it'll be very interesting to see at this point. I think you're right. They're trying to find out from the Europeans and the Americans where they stand, and then they're going to come with their counteroffer, so to speak. So we'll know more here very soon, I'm sure, because they have to move fast, because everybody's starting to realize that it appears that this invasion is not going to happen. And even if they felt like they had to take their military countermeasures like they've talked about, they're going to they're probably going to just send, like they said, send troops and forces to places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, maybe put some vessels in international waters that are sort of in reach of DC, these kinds of things. We've already threatened Moscow with nuclear attack with a lot of these different sites we put in Eastern Europe. So it's certainly, they have to do something in order to get the concessions that they're, at this point, they have, this is a real,
you're making
window of opportunity is.
Yeah, I think a very important point that we're kind of maybe even seeing with North Korea right now too, which is, even if this isn't all a major Russian military buildup or anything like that, Russia certainly hasn't. They have said they're not invading and everything like that, But at the same time, I do feel like to some extent Russia is playing into the, we might invade narrative, not in a major way, but there are Russian troops that have moved into the area. The war games that they're having right now with Belarus are kind of a rapid set up situation. They weren't like long planned war games or anything like that. And so moving the S-400s into the region, other missile to air defense systems are significant moves. Russia has kind of made the all options on the table statement. I think what they said, military and technical, are a military technical solution, which again, I think in Russia kind of translates to all options are on the table. And so all this has created a situation where there is maybe a little bit of a threat from Russia. And this is essentially the only thing in the past, I don't know, 10 years or so, maybe other than the negotiations around the New START treaty and then Biden extending the New START treaty, where any kind of, because serious diplomacy on the American side has taken place. And so it could be that, countries start to calculate that you have to like really go out there, push the Americans to a red line that, the Americans obviously aren't willing to cross, and then they'll be willing to talk to you on a range of reasonable issues. Or I think there's still some other possibilities here too, including that the U.S. doesn't want to make the concessions and we end up in a conflict. But Connor, before we move on to Iran, just one real quick thing I wanted to mention, and that is that the New York Times apparently has issued a FOIA, and they're seeking emails from, I believe, the U.S. Embassy in Belarus from 2015 to 2019, and about the word Hunter Biden is what they're looking for. And so this seems, the Romanian embassy, not the Belarusian embassy, the Romanian embassy. And so this seems to indicate that the New York Times is maybe interested in a little bit of that story that there may have been something corrupt about Hunter Biden's business dealings in Ukraine, being on the board of Burisma, why Joe Biden was the American overlord of Ukraine, Burisma being a major Ukrainian national gas company for a guy that didn't have experience in energy or speak Ukrainian, is an interesting job post. And so the New York Times looking into that suggests there's something there. And of course, all that was heavily censored around the election last year. And I guess, while a lot of the election questioning seems kind of ridiculous, you do have to wonder what might have been if the media had taken that true story as seriously as they should have, instead of willingly not covering it because a couple former U.S. intelligence officials who supported Joe Biden said that it was Russian disinformation. But Connor, let's move on